Are we here? Awesome. Do we have viewers?
Not yet. They'll show up. Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Cool. Just like say something when we have viewers, and then I'll start talking, and we'll get to talk to people.
We got 3 viewers.
We got 3 viewers. Awesome. So we're going to take, I think, maybe a couple minutes, see about if there are more people who are going to show up for a little bit. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the weed program. We're going to be talking about weeds, specifically non-native invasive species. Plants that you're going to find in your yard, things that you're going to find in open space, in parks, cityscapes. Basically anywhere where there's soil, you're probably going to find a weed. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes, see as more people come in, and then we'll all introduce ourselves and introduce you to where we're at today, and then we'll go on our walk. So just be patient. I'll do some dancing.
10 people.
10 people. Oh, sweet. Okay. Uh-oh. Oh, now the pressure's on.
No, she's good.
Just kidding.
She loves us.
Okay.
Hey, Mom.
Awesome. All right. You know what? I'll just get started because it seems like we're getting quite a few more people in. So, welcome everyone. We are here at Ulistac Natural Area. My name is Kat. I'm an educational aide with the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority. And I'm here actually with the mastermind behind the camera, which is Terry Rogaway, who's actually our educational programs coordinator. So if you've ever been on an educational program with Terry, feel free to put a thumbs up in the chat because she's awesome. And I'm also here with Anna Marie. So if you've ever gotten to see Anna Marie behind the scenes, definitely give her a thumbs up because she's awesome. So anyway, I thought we'd go ahead and we're going to go for a walk today and discuss the native or the non-native invasive plants that you're going to find around the Bay Area. Probably in your yard, probably in the open space, probably in the cityscape, probably in the cracks of the sidewalk that you walk every day. So why don't I go ahead and introduce first the agency, then the place. So we are a part of the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority, which is an agency that works to protect wildlife habitat, water resources, and working agricultural lands. And a big part of our mission actually is to help increase access to nature, to natural areas. And a part of that is we have an urban grants program. We also have helped fund a lot of urban open spaces. And one of those open spaces is actually here, Ulistac Natural Area. So Ulistac is amazing. It's about 40 acres of basically the last undeveloped land in Santa Clara City. And over the past, I want to say 10, almost like 12 years. No, actually almost 20 years. Almost 20 years. Ulistac has been here, and people from the surrounding community, neighbors, community members, and volunteers have been here helping to restore this area, to pre-contact, basically restoring native plants, restoring native habitat, and inviting people from the surrounding neighborhood to come out for a walk and enjoy nature. As you can tell, we hear lots of birds out here. I hear titmice, chickadees, and there's a really raucous mockingbird over in that tree. So we might hear some hawk noises, planes, kestrels, you name it, it's a pretty wild place. So before we get too far into the weeds, I do want to establish some common language. I talk about weeds, and everyone kind of has their own idea of what a weed is. So why don't we take a couple minutes, and I want you guys to write down in the chat how you define a weed. And secondly, what is a weed that you have encountered recently in your life? Maybe it was at a park, maybe it was a cityscape, maybe it was, in the sidewalk or in your garden. Just go ahead, take a couple minutes. That way we can get an idea of how you guys define weeds. What kinds of things are we getting? Terry, you want to mention anything?
Angie loves Ulistac.
Angie loves Ulistac. I love Ulistac too. Do you have any weeds?
No, not yet. Oh, anything that grows wild.
Anything that grows wild. That's a good one. Okay.
A non-native invasive species, usually that outcompetes natives.
I like that definition. That's a very good one. We're going to be talking about that.
Something non-native.
Mm-hmm.
Dandelions.
Dandelions. That's a very iconic one. Whenever everybody thinks of like a weed, they think dandelion.
Ron Horry says a weed is a plant that you don't want.
Yep. Awesome.
Plant growing in the wrong place.
Haha, yeah. So when gardeners often talk about weeds, we talk about weeds in terms of things that we don't like, things that we don't want in our gardens. They are the undesirables, which is kind of sad because, in the places where they come from, they're obviously, native to certain places in the world, and they are desirable in those places. So, they're out of place. And in order to help discuss like this definition of weeds, I'm actually going to point out a plant that we have here right behind me. So right behind me, we have a couple of really solid looking trees. Can anybody name what kind of trees those are? These big tall ones right in front of me here. Do we have any answers?
They're still on weeds.
They're still on weeds.
Cranesbill, oxtongue, fillery.
Ooh. We might get to fillery. There's plenty of fillery here.
And those ukes. Woo!
Oh yeah. So these are eucalyptus. These are eucalyptus. You can actually, very easy to identify. They're very common throughout the Bay Area. And you can identify them based on the shaggy bark that sloughs off and forms piles around the trees. They also have these very long, lanceolate-looking leaves. And if you've ever been in a eucalyptus grove, you know what it smells like. It smells like Vicks Vapor Rub. It's a very, very crisp, nice smell. But these trees have a bit of a controversial history here. So eucalyptus were actually brought in the late 19th century, and they were thought to be a really good timber tree. So, there was a guy there, Frank Havens. He brought these trees here to basically for a railroad tie boom in the late 19th century, and he very quickly found out that they don't make great timber. And in fact, because these trees are so well adapted to our Mediterranean climate, they are originally from Australia, so they ended up spreading to other areas. And the other thing about them that people don't necessarily like is they slough off all this bark and all these leaves, which creates a bit of a fire hazard in California. And if you've been here in California for any length of time, or even just watched the news, you know that wildfires are a really big issue here. So there's some negatives. But on the other hand, can you hear that bird song? There are lots of birds here that they use the trees as habitat, as cover. I do know I've read that red-tailed hawks will actually use the trees as nesting locations. And if you've ever been to Pacific Grove, and I do highly recommend it, they have a monarch butter sanctuary there, and all of those trees that those monarch butterflies are overwintering in are eucalyptus. So there are some pluses, there are some minuses. Does that make this tree a weed? Yeah, maybe, right? So since I'm, as a part of our agency, we work to protect wildlife habitat. We're really focusing on removing plants that are A, invasive, and B, that are non-native. Because birds are really well adaptive. They can adapt to just about any kind of tree. And what they really need are native plants that feed native grubs, native caterpillars, and eucalyptus don't really do that. The other thing that we really care about is we also care about reducing wildfire potential. And so, eventually, we'd like to be able to get rid of trees like eucalyptus. They're not necessarily the greatest trees. Yeah. Yeah. They're not necessarily the greatest trees here. But, back in Australia, they are a very intrinsic part of that ecosystem. So I wanted to highlight that. When we talk about weeds today, we're going to be focusing a lot on invasive plants. We're going to be talking about non-native plants. Cool. So why don't we go ahead and get on our walk and check out some of the plants that we have around here. We're going to move on because I have spotted another invasive plant. Let's see about getting in here. Ba-dum. Aha. So we're actually going to set up, we want to focus on this one first. Does anybody know what that one is? This plant is right here. Ow. It's kind of pokey. This is definitely a type of weed that you're going to want to have gloves with when you're trying to remove it from your yard or your open space. And this is one that I know our technicians really dislike because it
says it's milk thistle.
Then you are correct. This is milk thistle. And I want to identify it and kind of distinguish it from another thistle that we have right here. Milk thistle tends to have really broad looking flowers. They're really big, puffy. They have these a lot of different petals, a lot of different flowers within the flower head here. They have these spines on the outside of the buds. This plant doesn't look too healthy. It looks like it's just past its prime. It's about to disperse its seed. So you can actually see the seeds coming out of there, just like that. And then you can also tell milk thistle based on, they have really, really healthy looking plants, really broad leaves. They also have like milky stripe whiteness to their leaves. And that's a big distinguishing factor between them and some other non-native thistles that we have here. You can actually eat milk thistle. It is an edible. Now, when I talk about foraging and I talk about, edible plants, I do want to make a very strong distinction. Make sure that you know what it is. Make sure it hasn't been sprayed. And also make sure you have permission from the landowner or the land agency from whence you're collecting, if you decide to collect, any kind of plant or any kind of natural object. We're here at Ulistac and no collecting is allowed. But if you find this stuff in your yard, might be cool to try out. I haven't personally tried it. I think that they're going to be a lot of work to process because you have to be able to remove all the spines from the plant in order to eat it. But otherwise, like, it's a good use for a plant that is otherwise kind of detrimental to our open spaces. In order to remove the weed, our technicians use a different method. They will often mow it down. And then we have volunteers and other people who will then like actually remove them via the roots and everything. So you do want to be able to remove the entire plant when you are in the midst of doing that, and you want to do it before it goes to seed. So this is a bit late if we were to try to remove this weed, if we were part of a volunteer party today, we'd be a little late in these guys. The other type of thistle that I also wanted to point out is actually over here. And this is Italian thistle. So this is a very different type of thistle. And you can tell it's actually very different looking than the milk thistle. It tends to have slender branches, more slender looking leaves. It still hurts when you touch it, so you just want to be careful. Definitely wear gloves. I'm out here, I'm not really aiming to pick any weeds or pull any weeds today, but you do want to be careful when you're messing with thistle because they are painful. You can also tell Italian thistle based on their cylindrical looking flowers. They have very different flowers than the milk thistle back here. They're slender, they're more cylindrical, and they're smaller in general. A thistle plant in general can put out hundreds of seeds per plant.
I would like to know if milk thistle is a native.
Milk thistle is not a native. It is actually native to Eurasia. Yeah. And in fact, both milk thistle, Italian thistle, and the bull thistle, which we won't get to see today, they're all non-native. And they're all really detrimental to our open spaces because they tend to form like really thick thatch. And that thatch tends to outcompete any other kinds of like native vegetation.
Ray was saying that it's said to be good for liver problems, but it's not FDA approved.
Okay, that is something I didn't know. So I definitely did some more research on that. So we got a lot more weeds to talk about today. So we're going to end up moving on back towards the path, I think. We're going to try to maintain our 6 feet of social distance while we're doing this. And I am also tethered to Terry. So please bear with us. We are trying our best not to get too close. And also not to clothesline either. 10 to 1 at some point during this program, I'll end up walking away and forgetting that I'm attached to Terry, and then you guys will lose sound, and then you will laugh at me. Hopefully you'll laugh with me. All right. Yes, now we can get to the path. Perfect. Let's see. There are so many weeds to choose from. Where do we start? So this one is one that I actually just learned about very recently because I was like, what are these little tufts of like flowers that are coming out? So we're going to train our camera on this guy. Does anybody know what that is? This weed right here. It's probably something that you've seen around. I've definitely seen it in a lot of other places.
Someone said grass.
Brass?
Grass. Someone else said Ian says plantain.
That is a very good answer. So I did my research on this one. It's called English plantain or ribwort plantain. And I think the reason why it's called ribwort is because when you look at the leaves, they have these parallel veins. And when you touch them, you can actually feel the veins on them, like very distinctly. They're very very distinctive to touch. They have these really skinny, like flower stems coming up, and they usually, their inflorescence or flower rises up above the plant. And as a part of my research when I was looking at them, apparently, so this comes near and dear to my heart because I studied anthropology and archaeology. But archaeologists actually look at the pollen of this plant when looking at archaeological sites. And what people are usually trying to figure out is when you find pollen at an archaeological site, it's an indication that people are basically, it's an indication of early animal husbandry because English plantain or ribwort plantain is used, or it wasn't used, but it's very commonly found in foraged or in grazed areas. And it's very highly associated with the trampling effect of hooves and of those grazed areas. So it found its way to the United States, obviously. And according to my research, I was not able to find like any significant invasive effects on this plant. It doesn't form really dense stands, and as you can tell, it's also really short. So it tends not to overgrow other like native plants. If you have a chance to remove it, do it. But we don't have it as like a very high priority as far as invasives go. But very cool one to check out. I'm gonna go ahead. Oh, I know what we're gonna talk about next. We're gonna talk about it's just avoid clotheslining. Woo! Let's see. Oh yeah, I like this. So, is it possible? Sorry about that. Is it possible to train the camera on these guys, on these very dead looking grasses here? Okay. Because they are dead, but I want to point something out about these. And yes, I will check myself for ticks afterwards. I doubt that there are too many out here, but I am in the middle of them. So, I will do that. So right here, we're looking at a huge field. Huge field. It's like it covers a very large part of this area of Ulistac. And what this plant is it's called wild oats. They are related to our domesticated oats that were domesticated back in the Fertile Crescent, in the Mediterranean about 11,000 years ago. But these oats in particular were actually brought, sorry about that, my glasses are fogging up. They were actually brought to the United States by the Spaniards during the mission period. The Spaniards believed oats to be very good forage for cattle. And so they were meant to feed the large herds of cattle that would be around the missions in order to feed the settlements there. So this is a grass that you see all over our open spaces. And it's one that you may find in your very own garden. One thing that I do want to note is I've heard that people do like try to forage like the seeds and stuff and see whether they can make meal out of it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, and part of it has nothing to do with the edibility of the seeds, but that it's a quirk of domestication actually. So you might see that some of these plants, wild oats, you can identify them based on the seed heads. They tend to hang like bells off of the stems. And these seeds right here have lost the seed inside. You can tell it's an open capsule. There's nothing in there. with most of your wild grains, that's essentially going to be the case at this time of year. The grasses dry out, they're all done with their growing season, and the little connective point between the seed and the plant, it's called a rachis. It tends to dry out. And so that rachis, it gets really brittle, and as soon as the wind just shifts a little bit, it shatters the seed falls to the ground, and it is ready for its next life cycle. With domesticated grains, we were smart. We came out to the fields and we selected for plants that did not have a brittle rachis. So you might find oats here that still have the seed inside, and I can pull these seeds out pretty easily. You know, they're really funny looking seeds. They have like little hairs on them. They have a little like stem on thing hanging out there. And basically our ancestors from Europe and Asia, they selected for plants that didn't have a brittle rachis, that had a non-brittle rachis. And that meant that the plants would hold on to their seeds until a human would come by and harvest it. And when those humans harvested those plants, they were unintentionally selecting those plants. They would obviously grind up some of those seeds for use in their meal, and then they would plant the next year's crops. And, you know, over dozens and dozens of generations, you find basically domesticated oats and domesticated wheat and domesticated rye. So it's a really interesting fact. In these wild populations of oats, you're going to find plants that have already dropped their seed, and you're going to find plants that haven't dropped their seed yet. And that's the natural variation of a population like this. But when humans come in and we're looking at making our lives easier and planting foods, we're going to be looking at plants that will help us. So we're going to select for things that hold on to their seeds so that we can pick those. It's really interesting. The same thing kind of happened with corn. I could get into that, but that's like an entirely different subject. But super cool. We're going to go ahead and keep walking on down the path. I do want to mention that this, again, is obviously a monoculture in terms of a species. Like, wild oats do grow very tall. They tend to overgrow just about everything else in the field. But they're actually relatively easy to handle in an open space because, again, they were foraged for cattle. So we, at the Open Space Authority, we actually help to manage fields of oats and other non-native grains by having cattle graze those fields.
We're at about 10:30.
We're at 10:30 already? Oh my gosh. We're moving so fast. All right, let me keep an eye out for another species that isn't oats. Oh, here's one. Does anybody know what this is? Does anybody have any idea on what this grass is? It's really interesting. It's got like a skinny, compact seed head. It's actually still pretty green looking at the base. It's got really skinny leaves, like almost non-existent almost. They're not really visible.
Rye is what Melanie said.
Somebody says rye. That's a really good answer. It's not quite what I'm looking for though.
Somebody else said wheat.
Okay. So this is another plant that has been brought to the United States as a really good forage plant for cattle. And the name of this is actually back east, it has a relative. Sorry, there's a plane overhead and I'm trying to talk over the plane. But the relative back east is called canary grass. This kind of grass is called harding grass. Harding, harding. And this is actually, I think, when we made the Eventbrite for this program, this is the grass that picture on there was of. So harding grass was brought to the United States. It's a really good forage plant because it's still green. A lot of cattle still like to eat green things even during the middle of the summer. This plant is really good at retaining moisture even in the middle of summer. It tolerates really dry conditions. It also, there's something called pugging that happens in the wintertime, and this plant helps to reduce pugging. So pugging is when livestock are in a field and it's really wet, especially like in our case in a winter. It's really wet in the fields, and the cattle, they like stomp down the ground and they reduce all the oxygen in the ground, and then they also it's all muddy and they churn it all up, and it's not really great for soil and it's not really great for a lot of plants, but it doesn't bother the harding grass, not at all. So I did want to mention that it is considered a pretty noxious invasive weed. And the reason that is because it can form pretty dense stands in places. And when it does that, and when it does eventually dry out, it is a pretty big fire hazard. So when we see it, we do try to remove it, if at all possible. And the best way of doing that is trying to get it before the seed heads form. And also grazing is a pretty big option, as I've mentioned before. And if you're trying to remove it in your own yard, I'd say make sure you remove the entire plant if you possibly can, and make sure you put down like mulch or weed cloth or something like that, because that'll help prevent those things from coming back. But yeah, it's honestly, it's a really pretty looking one, but I know better. Hopefully people will make better choices when they think about like good forage and stuff for cattle. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead, keep moving on down the path. We have, I see some other invasive grasses. So I'm gonna take a look over here. Oh no! I wanted to play in the dirt. I totally understand. I love to play in the dirt too. Whew. Well, maybe. Oh, there's so many in here. Oh, let's talk about that one. I like this one. I saw them across there first, and then I was like, oh no, there's more over here. And then we also have mustards and other things over there. So I wanted to mention this grass. This is another, it's also considered another good forage grass. Does anybody know what the name of this one is? It's really, like dainty looking. You can tell the seed heads come out in these little tiny inflorescences. These, and I can hear that mockingbird in that tree. It's kind of distracting me. But grasses also have flowers too, but they're not as like showy as what you might find, on a dicot. So these are monocots. All grasses are monocots. They have like the parallel leaf veins.
Mohan said, is it purple grass?
It's not purple needle grass.
That's a good guess.
Purple needlegrass tends to, it's not necessarily the inflorescences that are purple. I think it's the seeds themselves. So these are actually more inflorescences. And this is called smilograph. I've seen a couple of examples of it where, like over here, you see those light green kind of feathery things, and then it comes out in these purplish plumes. And smilograph is another invasive weed. It is different than your purple needlegrass. Purple needlegrass is a native, and we love it. I really like that plant because our native bunch grasses tend to take up a lot of water. They're really good reservoirs for water in the grasslands, and they're really good habitat for a lot of native birds. So they're one of my favorites. But smilograph is a little different. It's very similar to the harding grass in that it will also form thick thatch. It tends to grow over a lot of native plants because it gets pretty tall. As you can see, I'm sitting here and I can hide in these weeds pretty easily. And they're not, again, because most of your non-native plants, they didn't evolve here on this continent or, even within California. They don't have any reciprocal insect relationships. There's no insects that really eat them, so they tend to grow really fast. They tend to grow really quickly. They tend to take over large spaces without any predation or any herbivory on them. So they tend to take over, and a lot of those insects also can't lay their eggs on them. Their larvae, don't eat them, and that can have a lot of repercussions for our birds, for instance, who like to eat those grubs and feed them to their babies, especially during this time of year. So, alas, smilograph, you're really dainty looking. You're really fun to watch in the breeze, but not necessarily the greatest plant from my garden. We'll step over here around this other smilograph, and then we'll talk about these big, tall plants that we have in the back here. So I do want people to know this one. There's anything that you take away from the walk today, I want you to know this one, because it's a pretty bad one, in my opinion. Does anybody have a type of vegetable in their garden that this reminds them of? And look at these umbel-shaped inflorescences. Want to see whether I can't find any leaves on these. Maybe. Ooh, I see leaves over here. Into the weeds, quite literally. So, actually, I have a little leaf here. You can see. Is that focusing on it?
There we go.
So they tend to have these yeah.
Poison hemlock.
Yes, it is poison hemlock.
Looks like fennel.
It kind of looks like fennel. But it really is actually in the parsley or carrot family. And I do want people to know this one because this, as the name suggests, it is poisonous. If you're ever out in a place and you're like, ooh, that looks like a carrot, I might want to eat that. Don't. You can tell poison hemlock from the carrots and from parsleys because they also have these red spots on the stems. You can also see them right in there. Is that a good focus there? Let's try to back up there. So that red spots on the stem. I'm backing up because I don't want to get in Terry's space. But yeah, those spots are called, they're called the blood of Socrates. Does anybody know the story of Socrates? Does anybody know who Socrates was? No. Anybody? Maybe?
He says, oh no, I thought it was fennel.
It's not fennel. In fact, I don't think we actually have any fennel here. I think it's all been removed. But that's another one. But no, this is, like I said, this is poison hemlock. And the reason why we call this the blood of Socrates, those red spots on the plant, has to do with the fact that, so Socrates was a Greek philosopher, a great thinker for his time, but he wasn't very well liked by the establishment in Athens. He tended to put thoughts, out there that were kind of against what the leadership was saying. And he was actually charged by the democracy in Athens for corrupting the youth. And for that, he was first asked to leave. He was first banished, but he considered that to be kind of below him. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to leave Athens. And so he volunteered himself to drink a cup of poison hemlock tea. This is a very, very toxic plant. This is a plant that we work really hard in our open spaces to try to remove as much as possible. We actually we just acquired the North Coyote Valley Conservation Area, and there we have a lot of poison hemlock kind of around the borders and stuff. So we're working really hard to try to remove this because it's not good for cattle. It's not good for any native or non-native grazers. It tends to form really thick monoculture stands. It gets really tall, so it shades everything else out. If ever there was like the epitome of like worse invasive, I think poison hemlock would be it. It is not a good plant. If you see it in your yard, you want to get rid of it because it's not very good. I have seen like a lot of native birds will try to nest in this stuff because it does provide really good thick cover, but that's because this has replaced a lot of the old marshlands that we had and all the old tule lands that we had. So if we had that old tule, if we had that old marsh, all those cattails and everything, they'd have plenty of nesting room and really good native plants to forage in rather than these kind of sterile stands of poison hemlock. So that's my 2 cents. Not my favorite, but definitely one that you need to know because it is, there have been cases of people accidentally eating this plant because they thought it was parsley and they thought it was carrot. There have been cases of children getting sick from it because they took the stems and they used the stems as pea shooters because they're hollow. So
Rachel wants to know, how do you distinguish hemlock from wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace?
So wild carrot doesn't have the red spots on it, the blood of Socrates, so to speak. So I think Terry pointed or was able to get a good look on him before, but there's like these little red spots along the stem, and that's a big distinguishing factor. They're also really tall, also really big plants. So just, keep that in mind. If you're ever unsure, don't ever try to eat it, So we're going to go ahead.
10:45.
10:45. Wow. We're moving along so fast. I think this program ends at 11:30. Is that what you mentioned, Terry? Okay. Oh, where's the other one? Oh, I think. Oh, there's actually a couple of different species in here of the same kind of plant. So why don't we'll try to get in here. Yeah, there's the yellow ones and then there's the white ones. So if we can, I'm hoping that, what? What's a cactus?
You think? Is that what that is? Or?
This is, so yeah, both of these are actually a part of the same family. I just learned this. I'm in the weeds again. So you have these little tiny white flowers. So these plants right here, these are actually called pepperweed, broadleaf pepperweed. And they're very closely related to mustards and brassicas. If you're an old gardener, you know the mustard family because it incorporates kohlrabi and cabbage and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and kale and all kinds of cruciferous vegetables. And they have kind of taken over in terms of these non-native. Is that a kestrel? No, that's the mockingbird. The mockingbird is making kestrel noises. Okay. He's trying to find a girlfriend, I think. Anyway, so like I was saying, this is called pepperweed, and it is a part of that mustard family. Now, all of your mustards are edible because they're all a part of that family. And as I've already mentioned, all these vegetables come from the same family. You can tell pepperweed because they have these itty bitty tiny inflorescences. And they also have these lanceolate looking leaves that come up from the stems. The leaves are actually slightly off from one another. And they're not umbel shaped. They're not umbel shaped the way they were with the poison hemlock. So that's another distinguishing factor too. So these guys are edible. They are considered a really invasive plant in wetlands, especially because they take up a lot of water, and they'll just take over an entire section. So they're not great in that respect. The same goes for their cousins, the mustards. So we have a short pod mustard here, and slightly different flower shapes, very small flowers. But if I don't know if Terry's able to get really close there, but they have 4 petals, and underneath they have 4 sepals for each flower. And if you were able to dissect this flower, you would also find 6 stamens, 4 tall and 2 short. That's a defining characteristic among all of your different mustards. The other name for the family is cruciferae, and it comes from the word for cross. And that's because those 4 petals tend to make a cross shape on the flower. So that's another way of helping to identify this plant. Again, if you have been here in California, especially during the springtime, in like February, March, April, May, you see the hills and they are covered with yellow flowers. And that's basically all of your different mustards. We have black mustard, we have field mustard, we have the short pod mustard, as I've mentioned. And there's actually a really interesting story. I don't think it has any basis in actual reality, but it is a myth that a lot of people talk about, and it's that in order to keep from getting lost, missionaries when they were, establishing the missions in California, they dropped mustard seeds along the way in order to help keep themselves from getting lost. So they would put them along the paths going from mission to mission. I don't think that has any basis in reality, but it is a really cool story. And we do know, in fact, that at least black mustard was brought during the mission period. You can actually, well, first off, you know it's a non-native just from the genetics of the plant, but secondly, you can actually find the seeds for black mustard in bricks of adobe in our missions. So we know that they brought them. Probably as another forage plant, and that kind of thing. But pretty interesting. Let's see. Wondering how far we're gonna get. We might want to walk a little faster today. I don't know. Do we have any questions from any other viewers so far?
Is mustard plant the same as rapeseed?
You know what? I'm tripping over my words. I have heard that term used to describe mustard, yes. Oh, there's another favorite. Here, why don't we, let's take a look at this guy. Yeah, I would say, I would double check it, but my first inclination is yes, rapeseed is another term for mustard. So look at that beautiful little flower there. Does anybody recognize this flower? You can tell it's a bit of a late bloomer. It's here at the end of May. Salsify, yeah. This is a really, I think that they're kind of pretty. I see them in open spaces a lot. And they are a non-native plant. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're super duper invasive because I don't really see them in large groupings, but I see a pretty substantial stand right in here. There's actually a couple of like unformed blossoms here and also seed heads that you can see, and you can identify this based on how the leaves kind of form up. They kind of curl around the stem just like that. They have parallel leaf structure, so they're part of that monocot, kind of family. And it's apparently, I read that people in Europe, in Eastern Europe, traditionally actually ate the roots and the leaves of this plant, and people still do so today in places like France, Germany, Spain, and also in Russia. So it is apparently edible. I say like it is a pretty interesting plant to find. But when I do find the seed heads, I mean, there are a lot of seeds that do come from this plant. So if you are trying to remove it, you want to be able to get them, as soon as possible before they flower, because once the flower sets into seed, it's going to spread all over the place. And when they do open up and turn into seed heads, they look a lot like dandelions. So you might want to keep an eye out for that as well. But kind of cool looking. It's a very nice bright color in amongst all of this yellow gold field. This is a very nice plant. Okay. Oh, do I want to talk about this one here? Or I want to talk about it over there? Maybe we'll talk about it over there. Let's keep moving. Haha! There's a few different ones in here I want to talk about. Has anybody seen this plant, these white flowers, before? Like these guys. So what I'm pointing out. You know what they remind me of? They remind me of morning glories. So these are actually a part of the a part of that same family.
Melody says bindweed.
Yeah, that is the proper term for them. But yeah, they are related to morning glories, but they're the more invasive counterpart to morning glories. Morning glories you often find like in the flower shop, and you can plant the seeds, and they're an annual, and they'll die back. These guys are perennials. They come back year after year, and you can tell that they're a part of that same family. They're very closely related because they have these like arrowhead shaped leaves. I'm not sure if you can see that very well. It's like, just like that. But yeah, they have these arrowhead shaped leaves, and they also have a characteristic looking morning glory like flower, the trumpet flower. Morning glories, and they are basically like, they use one flower per day. They open it up for one whole day, and then they close back up, and that's basically they're done. And they produce a lot of flowers, and they'll produce a ton of seeds. This plant, unfortunately, it's considered by the Department of Agriculture to be a real nuisance plant because it spreads over and in between plants that you want. It tends to grow in gardens and agricultural fields, and it'll grow nice down and low, and it'll strangle anything in its path because it's a vine. It will also has a very extensive root network. So you have to be able to get rid of the roots in order to get rid of the plant, because they will come back with roots. And they also, I wanted to say, they also have a tendency to put out a lot of seed, and their seed can be viable in the seed bank for up to 60 years. So that's a long time. You have to be working really hard and really diligently in order to get rid of these guys. And even then, you might not get rid of it because you might croak even before these guys do. So they're very prolific. I want to also say you'll find these even in the deserts, because they're so good at growing in areas that don't have a whole lot of water. They're very good at adapting to that. And I just showed Terry this other flower here that I'm kind of sitting on a little bit. But this stuff is also a non-native. I'm not entirely sure how invasive it is personally, but I love the name for it. This is called turkey tangle frogfoot. If you have any young ones at home, make them say that 5 times fast. Because it's a real doozy for me. I have no idea where it got that name. So if anybody has an idea about these little flowers here, please put a turkey tangle frogfoot. Yeah. I have no idea. I'm like, who named that? I want to know that life history. But yeah, we're gonna keep moving on. Oh man, I feel my allergies coming on. I've been sitting in weeds. Whoa. And I have a tickle on my nose, so I'm so sorry, guys. I feel like I'm gonna sneeze any minute now.
Don't forget to take the mask off.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
On the inside.
Mm.
Well, maybe you're supposed to, but
I think you're supposed to.
it could be trouble.
I'm trying to think now. We've talked about a lot of weeds so far. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, right now we're walking in amongst a lot of native plants, actually. There's some California sage, milkweed.
Where's milkweed?
Oh, yeah. So this is narrow-leaf milkweed right in here.
But that's not like a weed, right?
Nope, it's not an actual weed. That's a native that we like, because that's a plant that is a host plant for monarch butterflies. So we like that. Turkey tangle frog fruit. I want to rap on that. Can someone rap on that one?
Extra credit.
Extra credit, definitely. We talked about the plantain, the wild oats. What else did we talk about? Smiler grass. Oh, one that we haven't talked about that I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about. Maybe we'll see one in here. Is mallow. Yeah. So I'll keep an eye out for mallow. If we don't see any, I'll be kind of sad because it's that was a really fun one. It's really easy to identify once you get a good sense for it. But this kind of breaks things up a little bit though, because I know you guys have been like, oh my gosh, you're sitting in a whole bunch of plants. I found some cheeseweed. Cheeseweed. Okay, let's get over here. So this is the mallow. Let me get out of the way. Terry can do the thing. Yeah, that's actually... Sorry, the cable's in the way. It's kind of dying back, as you can tell. But this is mallow. And it's really identifiable based on the leaves. They have these big, flat, round leaves that kind of look like wrinkly dinner plates to me. They're palmate, so all the veins, they come out from a central point. And they do tend to kind of look a little wrinkly. They'll generally have pretty smooth edges. Like they'll be serrated, but they're not pointed. They're not like pointed out. They're more rounded along the edges. There's some here that are a little bit more pointed because those are newer leaves. Now, if you take a look at the seeds and the seed heads, you can guess why this plant has the name cheeseweed. And the reason it has that name, as you can tell, they kind of look like a wheel of cheese. They look like cheese wedges. Cheese. And you might think about another food item that this plant also produces, or a relative of this plant actually produces. Has anybody ever heard of marshmallows? So originally, marshmallows were made. The confectioner would get the sap from the marshmallow, which is basically this plant growing in marsh. It's a relative of the cheese mallow. It grows in a marsh. It's very similar looking. And what kind of like holds all these plants together is they kind of have like this mucus. When you cook it down, they make this mucusy kind of grossness. Plant boogers, yeah, plant boogers. I guess that's what you call them. But yeah, so the sap on the marshmallow was actually used originally in making marshmallows. Nowadays they use why am I blanking?
Some animal part probably.
Yeah, it's not that. They actually use They just use sugar, basically. I can't remember the exact term. It's like completely escaping me. But yeah, so they originally used the sap. Now they use like a man-made alternative, essentially. And mallows are they're pretty much all edible. I do want to point that out. People like to use the seed heads when they're like fresh and green. They'll use them as capers. The leaves themselves are edible in salads. The roots are edible. Like with anything, make sure you know what it is. Make sure it hasn't been sprayed, and definitely make sure you have the permission of the landowner. But yeah, have at it if you're curious about it. There's also something really cool, and a part of like that mucus thing that I was talking about. These are related to okra. So if you've ever cooked okra, you know, it tends to have like that slimy texture because it produces a bunch of mucus like these guys do. It's also related to hibiscus. So kind of a nice thing. If I could find one that's still blooming, I'd show you, but the flowers are very similar looking to hibiscus flowers. Very cool. All right. We're almost, it looks like I might have a few more plants to talk about, so we're gonna keep moving. Do we have any other questions from the chat?
Any different derivations of the frog fruit?
Yeah, some call it just turkey tangle. Some of them call it frog fruit. I believe it's, I think it might have come from Asia, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm hearing, is that a towhee? I think that might be a towhee who's doing the Let's see. I'm looking for some fillery. Maybe Terry will help me keep an eye out for some fillery in here. If we don't find fillery, then we'll have to make do with something else. Dun dun dun. We might have missed fillery. I think I might have just like, oh, there's a little bit.
Little tinky tiny one.
Yeah, there's a really tinky, tiny little flower here. I'm not.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, this is actually more of the cheese mallow right here. You can see the flowers there. They're not really blooming right now, but the fruits are still green. So you can see that there. And then this guy over here is this little tiny fillery flower. This is not a really great example, but fillery, I think it's really cool because, let me see. So this is the seed head, and they have a really cool adaptation. They're not native to here. Again, like all the plants that I'm talking about today, they are not native.
Uh-oh, the battery's getting low.
The battery's getting low. We might end pretty soon. So anyway, these guys, this is cut leaf fillery, and you can tell because they have these more fern-like leaves on them. They have these little tiny purple flowers. They often get mistaken like for red maid and stuff like that on our open space preserves, but they're not. They're completely different flower, non-native. But I was going to say, these seed heads are really cool. They actually curl and uncurl with humidity. So when the seeds are ready to disperse, you have like a seed head like that. It's all dried out and ready to go. It'll dry out and it'll spring off of the mother plant. It curls and it just goes boing off of the mother plant. And that's how it helps to disperse itself away from mom, away from all the other plants. So then it has the best chance of getting a good place to grow. The other thing is it actually digs itself into the ground. I'd recommend for you all, if you're at all skeptical, check it out on YouTube. There was a video on there that showed a fillery seed as it expanded, like it straightened out, and then it curled back up with the humidity that happens every single day. You know, as it gets later in the evening, it gets a little bit more humid. As it, gets hotter in the day, it gets a little less humid. So this fillery curls up, and then it straightens back out again, and it has this other little like tendril called an awn, and it'll like hook into the ground, and then as it curls, it digs itself into the ground, and then it'll straighten back out again, and then it'll dig itself even further into the ground. And it's really amazing, really cool to look at. Unfortunately, it's also a really invasive plant for some of those reasons. It tends to be very prostrate, so it grows along the ground. It tends to, choke out seedlings of other plants. And then, it's obviously a really good invader because it's able to spread its seed and also like dig itself into the ground like that. So very cool stuff.
I think what we should do is go ahead and thank them for coming, and just in case it cuts out,
Okay.
let them know that this will be on the webpage and they can see it.
Yep. Yeah. Why don't we do that?
And we'll go till my phone croaks.
Yeah, we'll go until the phone croaks, but we don't want to be rude if it just dies. So we are actually pretty much near the end anyway, so I'll just go ahead and step on over here. So I do want to mention, like, we talked about a lot of weeds today, and you probably recognize the majority of them. They're weeds that you'll find in your garden, in your open space, and your cityscapes and your parks. And I mean, I want you to consider for a moment, a lot of these plants had human history. They were brought over either intentionally or unintentionally. And so there is some purpose behind them when they were brought here. And so I just want to ask, like, our viewership right now to consider some of the plants they have in their gardens that had purpose, that have meaning to them. And don't necessarily think of like invasive non-native weeds as like not having purpose, but maybe reconsidering and thinking, do I really need to plant that? Maybe there's a better alternative. Maybe this other plant will be better for our native wildlife or better for our habitat. So I just, I want to put that out there because the people who came before us here at Ulistac, the Native Americans here, they also considered their own weeds and but most of their kinds of weeds were all native plants. They were just managing them for the benefit of the ecosystem and for their own foraging and their own food. So I think like the terminology of weed gets a bad reputation. But it's not to consider that, okay, where can this grow and when can it not grow here? What kinds of plants do we want to grow here? And so I just want people to kind of leave with that thought and thinking about like how they want to manage their own gardens. There are definitely tons of things that you care about in your own gardens, whether it be shade or aesthetics, or native wildlife, or just even a great place for your kids to play. So, I want to point that out. We also want to thank you, because I feel like the phone is about to die. We also want to thank you for coming out, or not really coming out, but definitely getting at your computer and visiting with us today. And I hope that you learned some cool things about the plants, the non-native plants that we have here at Ulistac and potentially in your own gardens. I also want to thank Terry for coming out to help manage this. Anna Marie had to leave shortly after we started, but she's been a really great support for all of our educational programs as well. I want to thank you guys as well, for coming out.
Pointing out that as a Ulistac volunteer, she just wants to thank you for this. She learned a lot today, and that this is a location people can volunteer also.
Yeah, so in terms of things that you can do, come out to Ulistac when they start having more volunteer parties. That come out to open space when we start having more volunteer parties, because we have tons of weeds that we want to manage too. If you don't have iNaturalist on your phone, get it, because it's a great way to help you identify plants, what's native and what's non-native. And having those observations on that platform helps us identify early detections of invasive weeds. Like, we've helped to identify, for example, stinkwort in some of our preserves and get rid of it early on because people have observed it on our preserves. So tools like that are really helpful for doing stuff like that. I also wanted to point out, like, very simple thing that you could do before you go to any new park or preserve, or even just stepping outside, check your shoes. Wipe off your shoes, brush them off, And that way you're not tracking weeds into different places as well. I just wanted to throw those things out there, things that you guys act on, and also have some food for thought in terms of how you want to plan your own gardens and how you want to think about the weeds in these different places. Very cool. Thank you all again. And I think we're pretty much
tomorrow. It'll be WERC with live animals.
Oh.
So tune in tomorrow to be able to see some birds of prey.
Oh, that's super cool. So yeah, tune in tomorrow on Facebook Live because WERC, the Wildlife Education and Rehabilitation Center in Morgan Hill, they're going to be doing a demonstration on birds of prey. At what time, Terry?
10 o'clock.
At 10 o'clock. So feel free to tune in. Hope you get to learn more. And we will see you next time. Bye.